Hello photographers, today I've got a DSLR manual mode tutorial for beginners. Now actually this also covers mirrorless cameras because these controls, these functions are universal to cameras. Now the first thing you need to do in order to shoot in manual mode is put your mode dial into manual, which means you need to spin the dial until it points at the M. And once you have it set on the M, you've unlocked all of the camera's controls. You now can change anything and everything. But we're going to focus on the most important settings. These are the ISO, aperture, and shutter speed settings. Now, as you can see right up here, I've got my camera display, and we're going to take a look at all of the numbers on that display. The first number that we're looking for is the ISO, and you can actually see it on the left-hand side of the display. Underneath the word ISO is the number 400. And if I want to change my ISO, I press a button. Now, which button you press depends upon your camera. If you happen to have a Nikon D3000 series camera, then what you're going to do is press and hold this function button on the side of the camera here. And while you're holding that button, you're going to spin the control dial on the back of the camera, and that will change your ISO for you. If you have a Canon Rebel series camera, then to change your ISO, you're going to press this ISO button right here, and that will bring up your ISO menu. And then you can either use the directional buttons on the back of the camera, or you can spin the camera's control dial located on the front near the shutter button in order to change your ISO. And if you have a Sony a6000 series camera, then the ISO button is right here on the back of the camera. But that button is also actually a full control dial. So what you do is you press the ISO button, then spin that ring in order to change the ISO setting. Next, let's take a look at the aperture. And changing your aperture depends upon whether or not you have a single control dial on your camera, like a Nikon D3000 or 5000 series camera or a Canon Rebel, or if you have two control dials like my EM5 Mark II here, the Canon 70D series, the D7000 series from Nikon, and cameras like that. So we'll start with the Nikon D3000 and 5000 series cameras. In order to change your aperture on those cameras, you have to press and hold this button right here on the top of the camera. It's marked with a plus minus icon, but you'll notice next to that icon there's another little icon here, and that icon represents the aperture function. So what you need to do is hold down this button while spinning your control dial on the back of the camera. And when you do that, you should see your aperture number changing. And if you're not sure which number that is, it is the number that has an F in front of it. On a Canon Rebel series camera, the button is right here on the back. You do the exact same thing. Press and hold that button and then spin your control dial. And when you spin that dial, you'll see your aperture changing. Now, if you have just about any other DSLR mirrorless camera, then your camera has two control dials. Most of the time, the two control dials are located on the front and the back of the camera, or on the top here, like you see on my EM5 Mark II. On the Sony, you have this thumb control dial right here, and then that rear control dial is the other one. Regardless of where your control dials are, one of those two dials will change your aperture. And all you have to do to figure out which one is spin the dials and see what number changes on the back of the camera. But before you start spinning your dial, here's an important tip. Make sure your camera is awake. If your camera goes into sleep mode, when you spin your control dials, you won't see any numbers changing on the back of your camera. So make sure you just half press the shutter button, and then you just spin one of those dials. Now I'm going to spin my back dial, and you'll see when I do that, that is my aperture dial. But if you spin the dial and you see this other number changing, then what you're spinning is not the aperture dial. So it's just process of elimination, figuring out which one of your dials changes your aperture. And after that, we're left with the shutter speed, which is actually the easiest one to change. On your Nikon D3000 or 5000 series camera and the Canon Rebels, you just spin the control dial. Don't press any buttons, just spin the control dial. And again, make sure you half press your shutter button to wake up your camera if it's fallen asleep. And when you spin that dial, you'll see the other number on the back of your camera changing. That is the shutter speed. And if you do have a camera with two control dials and you just spin the other control dial, the one that doesn't change the aperture will be the one that changes the shutter speed for you. Now, your shutter speed may look a little different from what you see here on my display, because on my display, you see this number like 800, but on some displays, you'll see this represented as a fraction. It'll say 1 over 800, and that is actually what the number means. If you see it just as 800 like I have here, that still means 1/800th of a second. So that's how you change your ISO, aperture, and shutter speed settings. But changing them is just the start. start. What do you change them to? Is the question. Here's how to get started with that. On the back of my camera and on the back of your camera or in your viewfinder, you should see an exposure indicator, just like the one on the back of my camera that's flashing -3 right now. The exposure indicator is how the camera communicates to you if you're going to be taking a well-exposed picture or not. And when you're just getting started with manual mode, the goal is just to get your settings set so that the exposure indicator is reading 0. If you do that, then generally speaking, you're going to have a well-exposed image. So let me show you how that works. I'm actually going to start with my ISO. And because I'm actually in a relatively dark location, I would use a higher ISO setting because it's dim in here. And generally speaking, when you're in dim lighting conditions, you want to use a higher ISO setting like 800 or 1600 or even higher. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm actually going to set my ISO to 3200. And once I've got that set, I can move on to my aperture setting. Now the aperture setting is a little bit confusing because you would think a bigger number would indicate that you're getting more light, but it's actually just the opposite. So you can see my aperture is set to f9 right now, and that is a relatively smallish aperture. And if you don't know what the aperture is, it's actually the opening inside of the lens that lets light through the lens into the camera. And the larger that opening is, the more light you'll get into the camera. So in order to make that opening in the lens larger, I have to select a smaller aperture number on my camera. So I'm going to spin my rear dial until I get to the smallest aperture number possible for my camera, which is f2.8. Now the last option I have to change is the shutter speed. And what I'm going to do here is change the shutter speed until that exposure indicator moves up to the 0. And I'm just going to start choosing slower and slower shutter speed. So the further down I go in this number, the more light I'm going to be letting into the camera. And again, that may seem counterintuitive, but you have to remember that these are actually fractions and that they are not whole numbers. So as you can see at 1/100th, my exposure indicator moved to -2. And if I keep going, eventually it's going to get to 0. Now see what just happened there? The camera went and it moved slightly and then it went to +3. Here's the deal. If you're holding your camera to take a photograph. Like if I pick the camera up here, you can see that immediately the numbers change. And this is a super important point. When you're setting your settings to take your photograph, you have to make sure that you're pointing the camera at the subject that you are about to photograph. If you don't, then your settings will be set for taking a picture of the thing you were pointing at. Let's say you go like this to change your settings and see what's going on the back of your camera. And when you do that, you're going to be setting your settings to take a picture of whatever is below you, probably your feet. So make sure you're pointing your camera at your subject. And when I point my camera at my subject, which is just the camera in front of me, you'll see that my settings have changed again. And now it's telling me I'm at -0.7. So I need to change my shutter speed a little bit more. But notice what happens when I move the camera a little bit. See how it bounces around +3, minus, and whatnot? This is going to happen when you hold your camera because you're not going to hold it rock solid and steady. Don't fight that. Don't constantly change your settings to try to get it back to 0. Just get it in the neighborhood of 0. And when you get it there, go ahead and take your picture. And when you take your picture, you'll get something that is relatively well exposed. Now, this is a pretty terrible photograph that I just showed you right here. And I want to take a moment to point out the fact that as you get used to shooting in manual mode, you're going to take a lot of terrible photos. So be prepared for a lot of your photos to suck. But that's okay because you need to get used to using your camera in manual mode. So what you want to do is spend time choosing ISO, aperture, and shutter speeds to get your exposure indicator to 0 and then take a photograph. So that's how you operate your DSLR or mirrorless camera in manual mode. If you have any questions, let me know down in the comments. And if you would like a printable reference guide that you can stuff in your camera bag so you have it with you, then go visit this link right here to get my free Manual Mode 101 PDF. And then do me a favor and like this video and subscribe to my channel. And again, if you have any questions, let me know down in the comments. But the most important thing for you to do is to practice this to get better at using your camera. So you better get out there and take some damn photos.